Between 1862 and 1865, 14 children vanished from the Sacred Heart Orphanage in Pennsylvania. They weren't adopted or transferred, they simply disappeared from all records as if they had never existed at all. Local Protestant families were suddenly seen with Irish Catholic children working their farms, children who spoke with thick accents and bore the distinctive scars of institutional life. When questioned, the stories of these families never aligned. The horrifying truth is revealed in recently discovered letters between the Mother Superior and Philadelphia's bishop. These children weren't missing. They were sold. Before we continue with the story of Sacred Heart Orphanage, understand this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you're ready to uncover secrets that powerful institutions try to bury forever, ring the notification bell and hit that subscribe button. And I want to know, comment below and tell me what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to hear what really happened to those 14 innocent souls? Let's find out together. The truth behind Sacred Heart's missing children begins not with their disappearance, but with the desperate circumstances that first brought them to Pennsylvania's rolling hills. In 1862, Lancaster County was a patchwork of prosperity and prejudice. The fertile farmland produced abundant wheat and corn that fed Union soldiers fighting in the Civil War, making Protestant German and English farmers wealthy beyond their ancestors' dreams. But prosperity brought problems. With so many young men marching off to war, farms desperately needed workers during the crucial planting and harvest seasons. The labor shortage was becoming critical just as government contracts promised unprecedented profits to those who could meet the demand. Into this landscape of opportunity and desperation came Sacred Heart Orphanage, established in 1859 by the Sisters of Mercy from Philadelphia. The three-story brick building sat on 40 acres of donated land just outside the small town of Strasburg. Its Gothic Revival architecture stood like a Catholic fortress amid the simple Lutheran churches and Protestant meeting houses that dotted the countryside. The building's pointed arches and crosstop bell tower made it impossible to ignore, which was exactly the point, a point that troubled many local residents. A sharp-eyed woman of 45, Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley had arrived from County Cork 20 years earlier with nothing but fierce determination and unshakable faith. She spoke with the lilting accent of her homeland, but her business sense was purely American. Under her leadership, Sacred Heart had grown from housing 12 children to accommodating nearly 60 by 1862. The orphanage took in Irish Catholic children from Philadelphia's overcrowded tenements, as well as the offspring of Irish immigrants who had died building the Pennsylvania Railroad through the treacherous mountain passes to the west. Their faces bore the distinctive pallor of institutional life and the hollow-eyed weariness of those who had learned early that the world offered no guarantees. The children ranged in age from 5 to 16. They wore identical grey wool uniforms, simple dresses for the girls, plain trousers and shirts for the boys, and attended daily mass in the orphanage small chapel. The older children helped with cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the extensive vegetable gardens that helped feed the institution. The orphanage treasurer and Mother O'Malley's closest confidant, Sister Agnes Flanagan, kept detailed records of every penny that entered or left Sacred Heart's coffers. Her ledgers, written in a precise Irish hand, documented the constant struggle to keep the institution solvent. The Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia provided some funding, but wealthy Catholic donors were few in Pennsylvania, and the ongoing war had made charitable giving more difficult. By 1862, Sacred Heart was operating at a significant deficit, a fact that kept Mother O'Malley awake during the long winter nights. The local Protestant community viewed the orphanage with suspicion that bordered on hostility. The Know Nothing movement had stirred up anti-Catholic sentiment throughout Pennsylvania in the 1850s, and the Civil War had done little to ease those tensions. Protestant ministers regularly preached about the dangers of papist influence in their communities, and local newspapers printed letters complaining about the orphanage's foreign children and their allegiance to Rome. Some farmers refused to do business with Sacred Heart entirely, while others charged inflated prices for grain and supplies. It was into this atmosphere of religious tension and economic pressure that Father Michael Brennan arrived in the spring of 1862. The diocese had sent him to serve as Sacred Heart's chaplain and to help Mother O'Malley navigate the increasingly difficult financial situation. Father Brennan was a different sort of priest, ambitious, charming, and possessed of a merchant's eye for opportunity. Unlike the elderly Irish priest who had served the orphanage previously, Brennan had been born in Philadelphia and understood the delicate balance between Catholic principle and American pragmatism. At 38, Father Brennan cut an impressive figure in his black cassock, his dark hair always perfectly combed and his shoes polished to a military shine. Having been educated at St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia, he spoke without an accent, and he possessed the rare ability to make both Catholics and Protestants feel comfortable in his presence. The local Protestant ministers found him surprisingly reasonable, and the wealthy German farmers discovered that he understood their concerns about labor shortages and wartime production demands. What none of them realized was that Father Brennan's understanding ran deeper than mere sympathy. He saw opportunity where others saw only problems, and he began to develop a solution that would benefit everyone involved, except, perhaps, the children of Sacred Heart Orphanage. The first sign that something was changing came in late May 1862 when Mother O'Malley announced to the staff that several of the older children would be placed with local families to help with spring planting. This wasn't unusual in itself. Orphanages had long arranged for older children to work as farm hands or domestic servants. But Sister Agnes noticed that the arrangements were being made personally by Father Brennan rather than through the diocese's usual placement procedures. When she asked to see the paperwork, Father Brennan assured her that he was handling all the documentation himself to avoid burdening the diocese's overworked administrators. The morning of June 15, 1862, dawned grey and humid with thunderclouds building over the Susquehanna Valley. Timothy Walsh, a red-haired boy of 14 who had been at Sacred Heart for 3 years, was helping Sister Margaret tend the vegetable garden when Father Brennan approached with a well-dressed Protestant gentleman whom he introduced as Mr. Ezra Hoffman, a prosperous wheat farmer from Lancaster Township. Timothy had been expecting this moment for weeks. Father Brennan had spoken to him privately about the possibility of working for a good Protestant family who would treat him fairly and pay him wages that would help support the orphanage. The boy was eager to contribute. He had watched Mother O'Malley's worried expressions during meals, had overheard hushed conversations about unpaid bills and dwindling supplies. If working for a Protestant farmer could help Sacred Heart survive, Timothy was willing to make the sacrifice. Mr. Hoffman examined Timothy with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock. He checked the boy's hands for calluses, asked him to lift a bag of grain to test his strength, and questioned him about his experience with horses and farm equipment. Satisfied with what he saw, Hoffman nodded to Father Brennan and counted out $45 in gold coins, an enormous sum that represented more than most workers earned in 3 months. "The boy will work through harvest season," Hoffman said, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent thick with authority. "He'll live in the barn loft with my other hands, and I'll send him back in November when the work is done." Father Brennan blessed Timothy and assured him that he was performing a great service for both his faith and his country. The Protestant farmer needed workers to produce grain for Union soldiers, and Timothy's labor would help feed the brave men fighting to preserve the Union. Sister Agnes watched from the kitchen window as Timothy climbed into Hoffman's wagon with his few possessions bundled in a cloth sack. Something about the transaction troubled her, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the speed with which everything had been arranged, or the fact that Hoffman had paid in gold rather than the paper currency that most people used during wartime. But Father Brennan seemed confident in the arrangement, and Mother O'Malley had approved it. So, Sister Agnes pushed her concerns aside and returned to her ledgers. 3 days later, 16-year-old Margaret Connolly disappeared under similar circumstances. She was taken by Mrs. Sarah Zimmerman, the wife of a prosperous German farmer, ostensibly to work as a household servant and help care for the Zimmermans' infant twins. Margaret was a bright girl with a gift for languages. She had learned to speak Pennsylvania Dutch from German immigrants in Philadelphia and could read Latin well enough to assist at Mass. Mrs. Zimmerman paid $60 for Margaret's services, explaining that she needed help urgently because her regular servant had run off to Philadelphia to work in a munitions factory. The pattern continued throughout the summer of 1862. Every 2 or 3 weeks, Father Brennan would arrive at Sacred Heart with another prospective employer, always Protestant, always wealthy, always in desperate need of immediate help. The amounts paid grew larger as the harvest season approached and labor became even scarcer. 13-year-old Patrick Murphy went to work for a merchant family in Lancaster for $50. 15-year-old Bridget O'Brien was placed with a banker's family in Colombia for $75. 12-year-old Sean McMahon, despite his young age, was taken by a mill owner who claimed he needed a boy to help with his horses. By September 1862, 8 children had been placed with Protestant families, and Sacred Heart's financial situation had improved dramatically. The orphanage was able to pay off its debts, purchase new winter clothing for the remaining children, and even add a small addition to the building to accommodate more orphans from Philadelphia. Mother O'Malley praised Father Brennan's success in finding good homes for the older children, and the Sisters of Mercy began to relax their concerns about the institution's future. But Sister Agnes continued to feel uneasy about the arrangements. She had noticed that none of the placed children had written letters back to the orphanage, which was unusual. Children who had been placed in previous years had always maintained contact with their friends and the sisters who had cared for them. More troubling still, when she tried to visit Timothy at the Hoffman farm, she was turned away at the gate and told that the boy was too busy with harvest work to receive visitors. The breaking point came on a cold October morning when Sister Agnes encountered Mrs. Hoffman at the Lancaster market. The woman was purchasing supplies for her household, and Sister Agnes approached her to ask about Timothy's welfare. Mrs. Hoffman looked confused and claimed that she had no idea what Sister Agnes was talking about. She insisted that her husband had never employed any orphans from Sacred Heart and that their farm workers were all local men who had been exempted from military service due to their essential agricultural work. When Sister Agnes pressed the issue, Mrs. Hoffman became agitated and suggested that the sister was mistaken about which farm Timothy had been sent to. But Sister Agnes was certain. She had watched Timothy leave in Ezra Hoffman's wagon, and she had Father Brennan's word that the boy was working at the Hoffman farm. The contradiction made no sense unless someone was lying. That evening, Sister Agnes confronted Father Brennan in his small office behind the chapel. She demanded to know the truth about Timothy and the other children, and she insisted on seeing the written agreements that documented their placements. Father Brennan was initially dismissive, suggesting that Sister Agnes was confused and had misunderstood Mrs. Hoffman's comments. But when the sister threatened to write directly to the bishop in Philadelphia, Father Brennan's demeanor changed entirely. His friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold stare that seemed to look right through her. "Sister Agnes," he said quietly, "you must understand that these are complicated times. The war has created opportunities that good Catholics must be willing to seize for the greater good of our faith and our institution. Those children are safe and well cared for, and their sacrifice is ensuring that Sacred Heart can continue to serve God's purposes." "What sacrifice?" Sister Agnes demanded. "What have you done with those children?" Father Brennan leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, considering his words carefully. "I have found them homes where they can contribute to the war effort while learning valuable skills from Protestant families who appreciate their labor. In return, these families have made generous donations to Sacred Heart that have secured our future. It's an arrangement that benefits everyone involved." But Mrs. Hoffman said what she needed to say to protect her family's privacy. Father Brennan interrupted. "The families who have taken our children value their discretion, and we must respect that. Some arrangements are best kept confidential, especially during wartime." Sister Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Father, are you telling me that you have sold those children?" The word hung in the air between them like a curse. Father Brennan's eyes narrowed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an unmistakable threat. "I'm telling you, sister, that you have a choice to make. You can continue to serve God faithfully at Sacred Heart, focusing on your duties and trusting in the wisdom of your superiors. Or you can pursue questions that will bring nothing but trouble to this institution and everyone in it. The bishop sent me here to solve Sacred Heart's problems. And I have done exactly that. I suggest you remember where your loyalties lie." The winter of 1862 to 1863 passed in an atmosphere of uneasy silence at Sacred Heart Orphanage. Sister Agnes continued her duties as treasurer, but the joy had gone out of her work. She found herself studying the ledgers with new eyes, noticing patterns that had previously escaped her attention. The donations that had appeared so providentially during the summer all came from the same source, a vague entry labeled "placement services" that corresponded exactly with the dates when children had been taken from the orphanage. She began to understand that what she had witnessed was not charitable placement, but something far more sinister. The children hadn't been adopted or even indentured in the traditional sense. They had been sold to Protestant families who needed workers but didn't want to pay full wages to adult laborers. The transactions were disguised as charitable arrangements, but the substantial payments made it clear that Sacred Heart was running what amounted to a human trafficking operation under the cover of religious charity. The realization tormented Sister Agnes through the long winter nights. She had taken vows of obedience to her religious superiors, but she had also taken vows to protect the innocent children in her care. The 8 children who had disappeared the previous summer had been her responsibility, and she had failed them utterly. Their trust had been betrayed, not by strangers or enemies, but by the very institution that had promised them safety and care. Mother O'Malley seemed genuinely unaware of the true nature of Father Brennan's arrangements. She spoke proudly of the orphanage's improved financial situation and praised the priest's success in finding good homes for the older children. When Sister Agnes tried to raise concerns about the lack of correspondence from the place children, Mother O'Malley dismissed her worries with the explanation that Protestant families often discouraged their workers from maintaining ties to Catholic institutions. Those children are beginning new lives, Mother O'Malley said firmly. We must trust that God has guided them to where they need to be, and we must focus on caring for the children who remain with us. But Father Brennan was already planning to expand his operation. As spring approached, he began conducting what he called evaluations of the orphanage children, assessing their physical condition, work skills, and temperament. He paid particular attention to the children who had recently arrived from Philadelphia, newcomers who had few friends at the orphanage and whose disappearance would be less likely to cause disruption among the remaining children. The priest had also begun cultivating relationships with a broader network of Protestant families throughout Lancaster County and neighboring counties. The success of his initial placements had created demand for more workers, and the approaching planting season promised to bring even higher prices for healthy, trainable children. Father Brennan spoke of expanding operations to include children from other Catholic institutions in Pennsylvania, creating what he called a regional placement service that would benefit multiple orphanages while meeting the labor needs of Protestant farming communities. Sister Agnes realized that she was witnessing the birth of a systematic trade in human beings, one that exploited both the desperation of Catholic institutions and the prejudices of Protestant employers. The Catholic orphanages needed money to survive, and the Protestant families needed workers who could be obtained more cheaply than adult laborers. Father Brennan had found a way to profit from both needs while maintaining a veneer of religious respectability. The psychological impact on the remaining children was subtle but unmistakable. They had noticed that the older children who left for placements never returned or wrote letters, unlike children who had been placed in previous years. Whispered conversations in the dormitories revealed growing anxiety about their own futures. The children began to see reaching their teenage years not as a milestone toward independence, but as a sign that they might be next to disappear. 10-year-old Mary Catherine Donovan, who had been particularly close to Margaret Connolly, began having nightmares about being taken away by strangers. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, crying for Margaret and begging the sisters not to let the Protestant men take her away. When Sister Agnes tried to comfort her, Mary Catherine clung to her desperately and whispered, "They're not coming back, are they? Margaret and Timothy and the others. They're never coming back." The question haunted Sister Agnes because she increasingly suspected that Mary Catherine was right. The children who had been taken weren't being trained for independence or given opportunities for better lives. They were being consumed by a system that valued their labor more than their humanity. And once they entered that system, they effectively ceased to exist as individuals with rights and futures of their own. As the snow melted and the first signs of spring appeared in the orphanage gardens, Sister Agnes made a decision that would ultimately expose the full horror of Father Brennan's operation. She began keeping a secret record of every child who was placed, documenting their names, ages, physical descriptions, and the families who had supposedly taken them. She also began discreetly questioning recent arrivals from Philadelphia about any siblings or friends who might have been at other Catholic institutions in the region. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears and revealed that Sacred Heart's missing children were part of a much larger network of exploitation that stretched across Pennsylvania and possibly beyond. In March 1863, as the Civil War entered its bloodiest phase, Father Brennan received an unexpected visitor who would ultimately unravel his carefully constructed network. Bishop Francis Kendrick of Philadelphia arrived unannounced at Sacred Heart, ostensibly to conduct a routine inspection of the diocese's rural institutions. But Sister Agnes quickly realized that the bishop's visit was anything but routine. Bishop Kendrick was a stern, intellectual man who had risen through the church hierarchy by combining theological scholarship with administrative precision. He had been receiving troubling reports from other Catholic institutions across Pennsylvania, reports of children disappearing from orphanages and schools without proper documentation and of suspicious financial windfalls that coincided with these disappearances. The pattern had finally become too obvious to ignore, and the bishop had come to Sacred Heart to investigate personally. Father Brennan received the bishop with elaborate courtesy, conducting a tour of the orphanage's improved facilities and praising the Sisters of Mercy for their dedication to the children's welfare. He presented the financial records with pride, explaining how his innovative placement program had transformed Sacred Heart from a struggling institution into a model of efficiency and sustainability. The bishop listened without comment, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the orphanage operations. But when Bishop Kendrick asked to see the documentation for the children who had been placed with local families, Father Brennan's confident demeanor began to crack. He explained that the records were stored in a secure location in Lancaster and couldn't be retrieved immediately. He promised to have them available within a few days, but the bishop insisted on seeing them before his departure the following morning. That evening, as Father Brennan worked frantically in his office to create the required documentation, Sister Agnes made a decision that required tremendous courage. She approached Bishop Kendrick privately and requested a confidential meeting. The bishop, who had served in Pennsylvania long enough to recognize the signs of institutional corruption, agreed to hear what she had to say. In the orphanage small library with only a single oil lamp for illumination, Sister Agnes revealed everything she had discovered about Father Brennan's operation. She presented her secret records of the missing children and described her encounter with Mrs. Hoffman at the Lancaster market. She explained her growing suspicions about the true nature of the placement services and her fears for the welfare of the children who had been taken from Sacred Heart. Bishop Kendrick listened in grim silence as Sister Agnes detailed what amounted to a systematic slave trade operating under the cover of Catholic charity. When she finished her account, the bishop sat quietly for several minutes, weighing the implications of what he had heard. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. Sister Agnes, what you have told me represents one of the gravest scandals in the history of our diocese. If your suspicions are correct, Father Brennan has not only violated his sacred vows but has committed crimes against both church and civil law. I want you to understand that pursuing this matter will likely result in the closure of Sacred Heart and significant damage to the church's reputation in Pennsylvania. Are you prepared for those consequences? Sister Agnes met the bishop's gaze without flinching. Your Excellency, I took vows to serve God and protect the innocent. Those 14 children trusted us to keep them safe and we failed them. If Sacred Heart must close to prevent this from happening to other children, then that is God's will. The bishop nodded slowly. Very well. Tomorrow morning I will confront Father Brennan with your allegations. I want you to be present as a witness, and I want you to bring every document you have compiled. We will get to the truth of this matter regardless of the cost. But Father Brennan had not risen to his position without developing a keen sense of self-preservation. He had noticed the private meeting between Sister Agnes and Bishop Kendrick, and he correctly interpreted the sisters' refusal to meet his eyes during evening prayers. That night, as the orphanage slept, Father Brennan gathered his most important documents and what money he could carry, and he disappeared into the Pennsylvania countryside. By morning, Father Brennan was gone, along with nearly $300 from Sacred Heart's treasury and all records of his placement operations. He had left behind only a brief note claiming that he had been called to serve as a military chaplain and would be departing immediately for the front lines. The note made no mention of the missing children or the families who had supposedly taken them in. Bishop Kendrick was furious at the priest's escape, but he was also relieved to have confirmation that Sister Agnes' allegations were true. Father Brennan's flight was as good as a confession, and it freed the bishop to take immediate action to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. He dispatched investigators to locate the missing children and began the process of determining which other institutions might have been involved in similar operations. What they discovered over the following weeks was a network of corruption that had exploited dozens of children across multiple counties. Father Brennan had been working with at least 3 other priests and had established relationships with Protestant families throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. The operation had generated thousands of dollars in illegal profits while condemning vulnerable children to lives of unpaid labor and social isolation. But the investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. Several of the children who had been placed could not be located at all. Some of the families who had purchased them had moved to other states, taking the children with them and leaving no forwarding addresses. Others claimed that the children had run away or died from illness, but could provide no documentation to support their claims. The trail of at least 6 children, including Timothy Walsh and Margaret Connolly, had gone completely cold. The discovery that several children remained missing transformed Bishop Kendrick's investigation from an internal church matter into a criminal case that would ultimately involve both state and federal authorities. The bishop realized that some of the missing children might have been transported across state lines, which would make their disappearance a federal crime under the laws governing interstate commerce and kidnapping. In April 1863, as the investigation expanded, Sister Agnes received an unexpected visitor who would provide the first real breakthrough in locating the missing children. Jacob Stoltzfus, a young Mennonite farmer from Lancaster County, arrived at Sacred Heart in a state of obvious distress. He had heard rumors about the investigation and had come forward with information that he claimed would help locate at least some of the missing children. Stoltzfus explained that his family had been approached by Father Brennan the previous summer about taking in a Catholic orphan to help with farm work. The Mennonites, as a peace church, had maintained neutrality during the Civil War, but they had also experienced severe labor shortages as their young men left Pennsylvania to avoid being drafted into military service. Stoltzfus's father had been tempted by Father Brennan's offer but had ultimately declined because the arrangement seemed to conflict with Mennonite principles about treating workers fairly. However, Stoltzfus knew of other Mennonite families who had accepted children from Father Brennan, and he had growing concerns about how those children were being treated. The Mennonite community was tight-knit and largely self-governing, but rumors had begun circulating about families who were working their orphan children like slaves and preventing them from maintaining any contact with the outside world. "There is a family in our district," Stoltzfus told Sister Agnes and Bishop Kendrick. "The Yodas, who took 2 children from your priest last summer. A boy and a girl, Irish children with red hair. The boy would be about 14. The girl may be 12. They work from dawn to dusk in the Yoda fields, and they live in a shed behind the barn. My wife has seen them at the creek when she goes to fetch water, and she says they look like they are afraid of their own shadows." Bishop Kendrick immediately dispatched 2 investigators to locate the Yoda farm and verify Stoltzfus's claims. What they found confirmed the worst fears about the fate of the missing children. The Yoda family had indeed purchased 2 Irish children from Father Brennan, Sean McMahon and his younger sister Ellen, who had been taken from Sacred Heart on the same day, despite being only 11 years old. The children were living in conditions that barely qualified as human. They slept on straw in an unheated shed, worked 16-hour days without pay, and had been forbidden to speak to anyone outside the Yoda family. They had been told that Sacred Heart had been destroyed in a fire and that all the sisters had died, leaving them with no one to turn to for help. The Yodas had also threatened to turn them over to Union Army recruiters if they tried to run away, claiming that Irish Catholic children were considered enemy sympathizers and would be imprisoned or shot. The discovery of Sean and Ellen provided the first concrete evidence that the placed children were being held in conditions of slavery. But it also raised terrifying questions about the other missing children. If the Yodas were willing to treat children so brutally, what might have happened to the children who had been sold to families with even fewer scruples or community oversight? The investigation took on new urgency when Bishop Kendrick received a letter from the Catholic Diocese of Baltimore reporting similar disappearances from orphanages in Maryland. The letter described a network of priests and religious officials who were selling children to Protestant families throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, with some children being transported as far south as Virginia and North Carolina. The operation appeared to be much larger than anyone had initially suspected, and Father Brennan had been just one participant in a regional conspiracy. As federal marshals joined the investigation, they began uncovering evidence of a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating for at least 2 years. The conspirators had developed a system for identifying vulnerable children, creating false documentation, and moving them across state lines to families who were willing to pay premium prices for workers who could be controlled completely. The network had generated tens of thousands of dollars in profits while condemning hundreds of children to lives of forced labor. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators located a farm in Chester County where 3 former Sacred Heart children had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The farmer claimed that the children had died from a fever during the harsh winter of 1862 to 1863, but the local coroner's examination revealed evidence of severe malnutrition and physical abuse. The children had been buried in unmarked graves behind the farm's barn, their deaths unreported to any civil or religious authorities. The farmer, a prosperous grain merchant named Samuel Crawford, initially denied any knowledge of how the children had died. But when confronted with the coroner's evidence and threatened with murder charges, he broke down and confessed to the investigators. He admitted that he had purchased the 3 children from Father Brennan for $200, intending to use them as unpaid farm workers until they reached adulthood, but the children had been weak from their institutional upbringing and had struggled to adapt to the harsh conditions of farm labor. Crawford claimed that he had tried to care for the children when they became ill, but he had been unwilling to summon a doctor because he feared that questions would be asked about their presence on his farm. By the time he realized how serious their condition had become, it was too late to save them. Rather than report their deaths and face difficult questions about how he had acquired them, Crawford had buried the children secretly and destroyed all evidence of their existence. The discovery of the 3 dead children sent shockwaves through the investigation and transformed public perception of the case. What had initially been viewed as a corrupt but relatively minor scandal had become a story of systematic child abuse and murder. Newspapers throughout Pennsylvania began calling for the immediate arrest of everyone involved in the network, and political pressure mounted for a comprehensive federal investigation. Just when we thought we'd seen the full extent of this horror, the investigation took an even darker turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when federal authorities finally tracked down Father Brennan and uncovered the true scope of his network. Federal marshals located Father Michael Brennan in October 1863 at a Union Army camp near Gettysburg where he had been serving as a chaplain under an assumed name. The priest had grown a beard and claimed to be Father Patrick Murphy from the Diocese of Boston, but his distinctive Pennsylvania accent and his knowledge of Latin liturgy eventually betrayed his true identity. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, Brennan initially maintained his innocence and claimed that he had been providing a valuable service to both the Catholic Church and Protestant families in need of workers. But the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal investigators had documented at least 47 children who had been sold through his network across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. They had traced financial records showing that Brennan and his collaborators had generated over $15,000 in profits from their trafficking operations, an enormous sum that represented more than most Americans earned in a decade. Under intense interrogation, Father Brennan finally confessed to the full scope of his operations. He revealed that the network had been his own creation, born from his observation that Protestant families were willing to pay substantial sums for workers who could be controlled completely. He had convinced other priests to participate by arguing that the profits would help their struggling institution survive the economic pressures of wartime. The children, Brennan explained with chilling matter-of-factness, were selected based on their age, physical condition, and social isolation. Older children who could perform heavy labor commanded the highest prices, while younger children were sold to families who needed domestic servants or help with lighter agricultural work. Children who had no relatives or friends outside the institutions were preferred because their disappearance was less likely to be noticed or investigated. These children had no future anyway, Brennan told his interrogators with stunning callousness. They would have spent their lives in poverty, probably dying young from disease or industrial accidents. At least this way, they served a useful purpose and contributed to the survival of Catholic institutions that could help other children. The priest's confession revealed the locations where some of the missing children had been taken, leading to the rescue of 11 more former Sacred Heart orphans, who were found working on farms across 3 states. But 6 children, including Timothy Walsh and Margaret Connolly, remained unaccounted for. Some had been sold to families who had subsequently moved west, taking the children with them to territories where federal authorities had limited jurisdiction. Others had been sold to families who claimed the children had died or run away, but could provide no credible evidence to support their claims. The investigation also uncovered evidence that several of the children had been sold to families who had no intention of treating them as workers or servants. 3 children had been sold to a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who kept them as personal servants in his mansion, forcing them to work without pay while forbidding them any contact with the outside world. 2 others had been sold to a Virginia plantation owner who used them as laborers alongside his enslaved African Americans, creating a grotesque situation where Irish Catholic children were held in conditions identical to chattel slavery. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that some children had been sold to families for purposes that went beyond mere labor exploitation. Federal investigators found evidence that at least 3 children had been sold to buyers who were specifically seeking young servants for what the documents euphemistically described as personal service. The investigators' reports, which were sealed by court order and remained classified for over a century, suggested that some of the missing children had been sold into sexual slavery. The full horror of Father Brennan's network became clear when investigators realized that the priest had been operating what amounted to a catalog system for child trafficking. He had maintained detailed records of available children, including their ages, physical descriptions, work skills, and temperaments. Prospective buyers could review these records and select specific children who met their particular needs, with prices varying based on the child's age, health, and capabilities. Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley, when confronted with the evidence of what had been happening under her authority, suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous collapse. She had genuinely believed that Father Brennan was helping to place children in good homes, and the revelation that she had been an unwitting accomplice to child trafficking destroyed her mentally and spiritually. She was removed from her position and spent the remainder of her life in a convent infirmary, never again able to speak coherently about her time at Sacred Heart. Sister Agnes, despite her efforts to expose the conspiracy, was consumed by guilt over her failure to act sooner. She had suspected that something was wrong from the beginning, but her obedience to religious authority had prevented her from taking decisive action until it was too late to save most of the children. She left Sacred Heart shortly after the Yoder investigation concluded and spent the rest of her life working with freed slaves in the South, seeking what redemption she could find through service to other victims of human trafficking. The trial of Father Brennan and his collaborators became one of the most sensational criminal cases of the Civil War era. The federal prosecutor charged them under the newly passed laws against interstate trafficking in human beings, arguing that their crimes were comparable to the slave trade that the Union was fighting to abolish. The defense attempted to portray the defendants as misguided religious officials who had been trying to help children find better lives, but the evidence of systematic exploitation and abuse was too overwhelming to ignore. During the trial, testimony from rescued children revealed the full extent of the trauma they had endured. Sean McMahon, the boy found at the Yoder farm, testified that he had been forced to work 18-hour days during harvest season and had been beaten with a leather strap whenever he showed signs of exhaustion. Ellen McMahon described sleeping in an unheated shed during the winter, sometimes waking to find ice on the blanket that covered her. Other children testified about being forbidden to speak their native language, being denied medical care when they became ill, and being threatened with violence if they tried to contact their former caretakers. The testimony that had the greatest impact on the jury came from 12-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan, who had been sold to a family in Baltimore County, Maryland. Bridget described being forced to work as a domestic servant from dawn until midnight, sleeping on the kitchen floor and being given only scraps of food to eat. When she had tried to run away, she had been captured and locked in a root cellar for 3 days without food or water. The family had told neighbors that she was a distant relative who was slow-witted and required constant supervision, preventing anyone from questioning her treatment. Father Brennan showed no remorse during the trial proceedings. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he delivered a lengthy speech in which he justified his actions as necessary for the survival of Catholic institutions during wartime. He argued that the Protestant families who had purchased the children were providing them with opportunities for useful work and Christian instruction that they would never have received in Catholic orphanages. He claimed that his only regret was that he had not been able to help more children find productive lives outside the institutional system. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Father Brennan was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while his collaborators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The judge, in delivering the sentences, described their crimes as a betrayal of everything that civilized society holds sacred and expressed particular outrage at their exploitation of religious authority to commit what he characterized as the most heinous form of slavery. The Sacred Heart Orphanage never recovered from the scandal that destroyed its reputation and decimated its population. The Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia closed the institution in 1864, transferring the remaining children to other orphanages throughout the state. The building was sold to a Protestant denomination and converted into a seminary, but even that venture failed within a few years. Local residents reported that the building seemed cursed, with strange accidents befalling anyone who tried to operate a school or religious institution on the site. For decades after the scandal broke, investigators continued searching for the 6 children who had never been found. Timothy Walsh, the red-haired boy who had been the first to disappear, was reportedly seen working on a farm in Ohio in 1867, but by the time authorities arrived to investigate, the family had moved on and left no trace of where they had gone. Margaret Connolly, the bright girl who had spoken multiple languages, was allegedly spotted working as a servant in a wealthy household in Virginia, but she disappeared again before she could be contacted by rescuers. The other 4 missing children, Patrick Murphy, Bridget O'Brien, and 2 younger children whose names had been deliberately obscured in Father Brennan's records, simply vanished into the vast anonymity of post-Civil War America. They may